Hey, what's up, guys? It's Bakes here, and thank you for joining me for this episode in my top 10 series. And today's episode is my top 10 most underrated bands. Today's list was actually a more interesting one than I first expected it to be because a lot more went into factoring this list than what I first expected. At first, I was just picking out bands and artists that I don't hear get brought up a lot of the time, but then I remembered there actually is a difference between being underrated and being unknown. So though being known and lesser known definitely played a factor into putting this list together, there still are some bands here that I feel like are pretty well known, but just don't get the recognition I feel they deserve. I also factored into account the discographies and legacies of some of these bands and artists, because I was thinking, okay, this band really is underrated, but is it because they only have one or two albums? But then again, just because they have one or two albums doesn't mean that they're not doing some really cool shit and, deserve to grow into something bigger and get the recognition and everything like that. But then on the other side of the same point, some bands have some larger discographies and, have done a lot of albums, but it's like, how the fuck is this band not bigger than they are when they have so many great albums, so many great songs and things like that? So like I said, a lot more factored into putting this list together than what I first thought. But now that it's all said and done, I had a good time putting this list together, and I'm also going to really enjoy, putting out some recognition to some bands that I feel like fly under the radar, and, maybe some more people can check them out. So without delaying any longer, let's get into this top 10 list, my top 10 most underrated bands. This first band was a good example of what I meant by finding the difference between being unknown and being underrated. So coming in at my number 10 is the band Movements, because Movements are pretty well known within the scene and fairly popular with people who do know this band. But this band has three full-length albums that are all great. Like, I can't undermine how great all three of their full-length albums are. Just all above average, and with their music in general, they just rarely miss. So putting it into perspective, I really thought this is an underrated band, and how they are not bigger than they are is just almost a crime to me. Just really good emo punk where they can balance some hard hitting stuff while also, switching up to some more somber, mellow stuff too. And lately they've been dipping their toes into different fusions, whether it's being some grunge stuff, but then also some dance kind of like vibes as well. So quite a bit of diversity too, to be honest. But like I said, hearing the casual, yeah, I know Movements, or yeah, I've heard of them before, just isn't enough to me. Like I said, they've gone 3 for 3 with their full-length albums, got a good variety of sounds and vibes, yet they still manage to feel so underrated, and I feel like they deserve to be bigger than they are as well. So coming in at my number 10 is the band Movements. Here we have another one on the grand scale of things, maybe isn't too unknown, but I feel is underrated for what he's doing. So coming here at my number 9 is Kenny Hoopla. And Kenny came along and made impacts around the time that Machine Gun Kelly and Willow Smith and other artists of that type sort of hit the punk scene. And for that reason, I think a lot of people sort of counted him out as someone just trying to get big off the genre that was kind of having a mainstream resurgence. But to me, Kenny is the real deal. He's not a poser, and just listening to his music, you should know exactly what I mean. This is legit emo pop punk with the energy, writing, and style to match. Can be fun and upbeat when the time calls for it, but also dark and moody when needed also. The only thing that still gets me is he still hasn't done a legit full-length studio album, and I don't know why, but it's a must. But as much as that's a must, you also must listen to this guy if you haven't, or maybe have passed over him for the reasons that I brought up before. But like I said, if pop punk and emo music is down your alley, check out Kenny Hoopla. Like I said, he comes in at my number 9. Coming in at my number 8 is the band With Confidence, which is continuing the streak of artists who maybe don't fall into unknown territory, but just seem so underrated. A pop punk slash pop rock band from Australia, which have actually now disbanded, which kind of sucks, but also in a weird way kind of made it easier to make a case for them being underrated. But another reason I know this band is underrated, I remember hearing a few interviews of other bands calling With Confidence their favourite underrated band. One example that I know off the top of my head was Ben Barlow, the lead vocalist of Neck Deep. He called With Confidence one of his favourite underrated bands. So if you're underrated amongst your peers, I'm sure you're also underrated, within the scene. But these guys have had 3 full-length albums, and again, like Movements, all of them are good. Not as good as Movements' 3 efforts, I will say that, but still underrated nevertheless. Their earlier stuff is inoffensive pop punk. Their second album is definitely where they hit their stride, and to me that's my favourite album of theirs. Just a little bit more creative with their flair. And then they close their discography with more soft rock kind of feel. But still a lot to enjoy from, a band a lot of people would describe as, a small Aussie band that, sort of had their moment. But a lot more to offer than, what a lot of people would make out. So coming in at my number 8 is the band With Confidence. For my number 7, I have the band Stand Atlantic, back to back with Aussie bands, but I will say these guys are slightly bigger than With Confidence, or at least here in Australia they are. They cop reasonable play on Triple J, which is one of our radio stations. They have a wider discography, and just one of those bands I always see pop up in places, whether it's their own headlining shows, opening for other bands, popping up at festivals. They always just seem to be around. Still, yet with that being said, I feel like they are just underrated however you look at it. Underrated Aussie band, underrated pop punk band, underrated female-led band. With female-led pop punk bands, most people gravitate towards the usual suspects, but these guys are something to check out if you haven't before. Going through their stuff, they started out fairly straightforward pop punk, and then moved towards having a more electronic influence, which I will say kind of started out a little bit shaky, but by the time they reached their 3rd full-length album, being this one here, Fear, I really feel like they made it work. And Stand Atlantic are still around, still grinding. They have a new album coming out this year, actually. So I'd love to see them keep going and, keep continuing to grow also. So coming in at my number 7 is the band Stand Atlantic. Coming in at my number 6 is the band Crazy 88s, which this was a fun one to give a nod to for more than a couple of reasons. This is a side project by many musicians, being led by Lauren Babick, who is known for being on YouTube and previously led a band called Red Handed Denial, and Jared Alonge, who is also very big on YouTube and is known for bands like Sunrise Skater Kids, Canadian Softball, and so on. They were later joined by the frontman of the band As It Is, Paddy Walters, who also had his origins on YouTube, but actually plays bass in this band, which is weird to think about because he's the frontman, lead vocalist of As It Is, plays bass in this one. But for a quick recap, you have Lauren on the vocals, Jared on the guitar, Paddy on the bass, and making this really cool mid-2000s feeling metal band. Now, they've only done an EP and 1 full-length studio album back in 2018, being this one here, titled Burning Alive. And I don't know if it was a one-off album, but honestly, I'm hanging on hoping that there's going to be more one day. I haven't heard any word, but just fingers crossed, please give us another album. Now, I couldn't say that they're overly underrated because each member has success and their own following in their own right. But again, when it comes to metal bands, or if you really want to get specific with it, like female-led ones, again, I feel like they are super underrated. I've also heard a lot of people critique negatively towards Crazy 88s. The main thing that I hear the most is they sound too mid-2000s. What the fuck does that even mean? Like, if it sounds good, who cares if it reminds you of, past albums or throwbacks or whatever. If it's good, it's good. Like, I really don't understand that critique, but I really like this album. I really like this band. I think they're underrated. Please give us something new, guys, if you're somehow watching this. But coming in at my number 6 is the band Crazy 88s. Three in a row now for female-led bands. That was not on purpose at all, but also back-to-back with Australian bands, so I guess that's me saying us Aussies are flying under the radar, guys. But here I have the band Red Hook at my number 5. Red Hook, again, are a band with a smaller discography, and probably the newest on the scene out of any band or artist that I have on my list today. But there is just so much to like about this band, and so much to jump on board for and support them as they grow. For a band so early in their run, they have quite the range of variety with pop punk, electronic, new metal, a bit of everything, but most of all, it's fun as fuck. Like, this is easily one of the most fun new bands on the scene at the moment, so guys, get around that. I know it doesn't help since I'm kind of comparing them to someone else on this list, but they are like a heavier, more diverse version of Stand Atlantic. Now, that's not me saying that they're better than Stand Atlantic. I'll still lean on the side of Stand. But for someone who knows Stand Atlantic, if you're one of them, get around Red Hook because you're also going to like them. As I said, they go heavier when needed, just fun new metal, electronic at some points as well. They've been known to chuck in some saxophone solos. I've definitely mentioned that on my channel before. So coming in at my number 5 is the band Red Hook. Coming in at my number 4, I have the band Alien Ant Farm. Actually one of a couple of bands that inspired me to put together this list of underrated bands, because a lot of people know Alien Ant Farm, but they don't really know Alien Ant Farm, if that makes sense. Now, I couldn't put them too much higher on this list because I feel like most people would at least recognize a couple of their maybe old school hits, or at least know their cover of Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal. I feel like everybody knows that song. But they are so much better than just one-hit wonders because they've got legitimate, full, front-to-back, solid albums. If you haven't, please go back and check out one of their earlier albums called Anthology. I think it came out from 2001, something like that. Check out that album in full, or even this new album that came out this year, Mantras, that I've got next to me, also really solid. Like I said, I feel like they've sort of been pushed aside as these one-hit wonders of the new metal kind of genre. I've only recently kind of heard that their cover of Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal sort of gets mixed opinions. A lot of people either really like it or hate it. I thought it was just universally loved. I love that cover. But Alien Ant Farm, as I said, a lot of people know them without actually really knowing them. They know the name, but they have so many fucking good albums and songs. So coming in at my number 4 is Alien Ant Farm.
There's a star on my chest where my heart should be.
Coming in at my number 3 is the band Teenage Wrist. If you're looking for a modern grunge band or something with a little bit more rough around the edges with their style of punk, you've got to check out Teenage Wrist. They're a band that I've been championing for a while now because they offer so much to the modern landscape of music with something very unique and enjoyable. I don't really hear anybody talk about Teenage Wrist, and when I was hearing people bring up the band, it was some time ago. Probably back around the time of their second album being Earth is a Black Hole, which was where I was hearing most people talk about the band, and to be fair, I think it is their best album, so maybe that's got something to do with it. But they've continued with another solid effort. As recent as last year, they had another album called Still Love, which I thought was pretty solid. I think it made my top 10 of last year. But like I said, if you enjoy punky grunge music with a little bit more of a modern twist, you can't go wrong with at least checking out this two-piece being Teenage Wrist, coming in at my number 3. Coming in at my number 2 is the band Slowly Slowly. Out of all the Australians offered on today's list, first of all, these guys are also the last, but these guys are probably the biggest over here. They get frequent plays on indie radio stations, nothing mainstream, but like I brought up before, Triple J, but definitely more airtimes than others previously mentioned. I'm guessing they've also been around the longest of the Aussies offered here today, and put together a solid and well-received discography. Ben Stewart, the lead vocalist, is making music constantly, whether it's with Slowly Slowly or one of his handful of other side projects. But this band is very good and grown on me massively over the past couple of years. They balance their sounds very well, mellow indie rock with some pop punk, some dance tracks, but then also some head bangers. One of their best qualities is also their songwriting. It's insanely good. Like I said, Ben can't put the pen down, so obviously he's got a knack for it. But the main thing that I want to push while I bring up these guys is they need to be bigger than just Australia. Sure, they can keep growing in this country, that's fine. But I haven't heard a single thing about these guys from overseas, anything online. Anything outside Australia. I just want to see them break the mold, and out of all the Australian bands that I've had here today, I feel like these guys can do it. So coming in at my number 2, I have the band Slowly Slowly. Coming in at my number 1, I have the band Waster. If you've watched my channel before or heard me bring up Waster in the past, you guys would just know that these guys were going to make my list for most underrated, because that's all I talk about. Waster are a band I can comfortably put into criminally underrated territory, because it freaks me out how little people bring up this band. And bringing it down to a more manageable size scope and focusing on the subgenre, these guys being pop punk, you have other pop punk bands like Neck Deep, for example, getting credit and hype when these guys, in my opinion, are just as good. And maybe shoot me for controversy, but comparing Neck Deep's more recent run with these guys have been more consistent. Like I brought up with my number 10 pick being Movements, these guys are also 3 for 3 with full-length albums, and they have no signs of missing the mark going forward. And again, a good spectrum of sounds when it does come to pop punk. Their first album, straightforward skate style pop punk, that would come to mind when people think of the subgenre. Jump forward to their newest of the 3 albums that only came out last year. Again, solid pop punk leading the charge, but trying some other stuff as well, and still making it work. As I said, they're 3 from 3. They have no signs of slowing down. Like I said, whenever I bring up Waster, I'm always going to champion them being underrated, and you guys are needing to check them out. So coming in at my number 1 is the band Waster. So there we go, guys, through my list of top 10 most underrated bands. As usual, before I wrap it up, a quick little recap. So coming in at my number 10 was the band Movements. My number 9 was Kenny Hoopla. Number 8 was With Confidence. Number 7 was the band Stand Atlantic. Number 6 was Crazy 88s. Number 5 was Red Hook. Number 4, Alien Ant Farm. Number 3, Teenage Wrist. My second place was the band Slowly Slowly. And my number 1 was Waster. Like I said, shouldn't have been a surprise to people that have heard me bring up Waster. They're so underrated. But thank you for joining me for today's top 10. If you have any underrated bands that you want to put on my radar, hit me up in the comments below. Or if you want to talk about any of these bands, let me know your opinions on them. Let me know if you feel like they are also underrated, or maybe you think I'm, undermining them and they're actually bigger and more well known than, what I'm leading on. But thank you for joining me for today's episode, guys. I appreciate it as always. Everyone subscribing, liking, commenting, all that good stuff. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you for another video soon, guys. Peace.